Hi. It's a nondescript week in 2015, and Nick Saban wants to make a point. He's giving a press conference a couple days before Alabama plays an FCS school, Charleston Southern, and Saban sees an opening to get all mad about a game that Alabama played a few years earlier. Here he is.
You all don't remember the Georgia Southern game, do you? I don't think we had a guy on that field that didn't play in the NFL, and about 4 or 5 of them were first-round draft picks. And I think that team won a national championship, but I'm not sure. And they run through our ass like shit through a tin horn, man, and we could not stop them. Could not stop them. Could not stop them. Because we couldn't get a look in practice. We didn't practice it right. All right, and everybody said the same thing in that game. Y'all took a week off. All right, this wasn't important. All right, so it's not important to anybody else. It's got to be important to the players, and it's got to be important to us.
That 2011 game between Alabama and Georgia Southern wasn't actually that close. It was Bama 45, Georgia Southern 21. But Bama gave up a bunch of rushing yards to Southern's triple option offense, and Saban didn't like that. And he used the specter of that game to remind his players via the media that anything can happen. At the point that game was played, the Eagles played in the Southern Conference, the SoCon. And a few years after that Bama game, Southern did in fact pull off an upset against an SEC Blue Blood, beating Florida in Gainesville. Richard's not here, so I can say that out loud. A few years later, Southern took the University of Georgia to overtime in Athens. And that same year, 2015, another SoCon school, the Citadel, beat South Carolina, an in-state opponent of theirs. These wins and these near wins, these upset scares have been thrilling, but they're treated first and foremost when they happen like a joke on the SEC schools involved. Most of the SEC takes a week off from conference play in mid-November every year. And when they do, they play a lot of FCS cupcakes, many of them in the SoCon. And whether the school is in the SoCon or not, many of us have taken to considering any SEC game against a non-Power 5 opponent in November to be part of something that the internet colloquially calls the SEC SoCon Challenge. The SoCon gets talked about, and at this point, honestly, most of the time is kind of college football's Washington Generals on the biggest stage. But if the SoCon is a conference full of Washington Generals, then the Harlem Globetrotters are basically, well, a bunch of former Washington Generals who then learn to spin the ball on their fingers and dunk really well. There is no SEC, no way, without the SoCon. One begat the other many years ago, and the story of the SoCon giving birth to the SEC, something it did nearly a century ago, is the ultimate precursor to pretty much everything that's happened in conference realignment since then. In other words, you can pity the SoCon at your own risk. You can joke about the SoCon at your own risk, because there's a great chance that if you haven't already, you personally are going to become someone else's Southern Conference. Welcome to Dead Letters. It's a split zone duo series that usually focuses on when bad things happen to good teams. But today, we're honing in on something else. When a bad thing happens to an entire conference. How does that league move forward? Does it remake itself? Does it stand pat? And is there any value to the name, brand, and the history of a league that no longer bears any resemblance to its old self? I'm Alex Kirshner.
I'm Stephen Godfrey. We're talking about Georgia Southern football.
And this is the season finale, episode 6 of season 2 of Dead Letters, the Southern Conference. Stephen, we've done a few episodes this season that have touched on the formation of the Southern Conference. The research for these shows has kind of been pushing us in the direction of telling a broader story about the SoCon itself rather than specific teams within it. So we figured we would go ahead and do it. Sewanee, a program that we covered earlier this season, came to prominence before the SoCon even existed, back when the Big Southern League was this thing called the Southern Intercollegiate. And that league at various times had more than 70 different teams coming through it. And by the early 1920s, this was a busy, busy league that had all kinds of different Southern programs. It had Alabama, it had Sewanee, it had Tennessee, it had Vanderbilt, it had Auburn, it had Georgia, it had Georgia Tech, it had Clemson. A few years before it had Cumberland, it had Kentucky, it had LSU, it had Mercer, it had Mississippi A&M, which is now Mississippi State. It had Ole Miss, it had Furman, it had so many different schools. The Citadel was in there, so many different schools that sort of bopped in and out of this old SIAA over time, that this just became a very crowded conference that at any given point had well over 20 teams in it and was just a massive neighborhood where a lot of schools seemed like strange bedfellows. And you might wonder, how did this ever happen? how could it have ever been the case that Southern college football was a place where LSU and the Citadel were sharing the same block? And how did that ever work? And the wild answer is that at the very beginning, college sports weren't actually really about football. They were about other things, some of them benign and some of them not. Here's Matt Brown. He's a dear friend of ours and a college sports historian who has literally written books on this stuff.
This predated college football. A lot of these organizations, what initially brought the Marylands and North Carolinas and Virginias and even some of the other schools in the deeper South together was about college baseball. And it was about track, and it was about figuring out eligibility issues, figuring out what to do about summer baseball, which was professionalized and was a major amateurism question over the first couple of decades of college athletics. And who can we play that's going to be committed to being the segregationists? Who can we play that's going to be committed to our institutional values?
And in this way, the SIAA becomes huge. In the very, very early days of college sports, schools were trying to figure out how to uphold amateurism and to make sure they had evenly matched and, yes, absolutely white teams to play against. That was their priority. And they weren't really thinking about how much money was being invested in football and how these programs might come to look many, many years later. But we all know the arc of college sports in this country. And as time went by, football just got a lot more important. Being big time on the gridiron became this thing that schools desperately wanted to have. We talked about it at the University of Kentucky, among others. Schools wanted to win in the sport that the most people watched, and they wanted to do it in what they saw as a dignified way. And the leaders of some of those bigger schools in the old Southern Intercollegiate were looking around the landscape. And this is a good bit of ammunition for you Big Ten weirdos out there. Some of these Southern presidents at these bigger schools saw what the proto Big Ten was doing, the Western Conference, and they realized they wanted some of that. They talked about it specifically. This is from the Winston-Salem Journal in December 1920. Quote, "They think that they can form a Southern Conference similar to the Western Conference, in which are Ohio, Illinois, Chicago, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Northwestern, and other institutions." Of course, people just called Ohio State Ohio back then, even though Ohio University was also in existence and was called by that name from 1804 onward. Very sorry, Bobcats. You got a rough shake, even rougher back then. The basis of this new league that these large school Southern presidents wanted to form would have a few points. And there were some specific policy disagreements that tended to separate the big from the small. So, yeah, they were opposed to the professionalization of amateur sports. They were opposed to players getting scholarships that were explicitly for athletics, etc. But there were two other things specific to this moment that led some of the bigger schools in the Southern Intercollegiate to want to do something different. First was the 1-year rule, freshman eligibility. A few schools already had this rule in play, but it meant, quite simply, that freshmen were not eligible to play. This one was interesting to me because it kind of strikes the brain the opposite way of what you might think. When you think of the schools that are going to become the heavy hitters in Southern college football, and when you think of it just means more culture, I don't think that the thing that comes to mind is that they would want a ban on freshmen playing. Like, you wouldn't look at Alabama today and think, wow, Alabama really wants all of its 5 stars to have to sit a year before Nick Saban can put them on the field. But limiting freshmen benefited the big schools of the day in a way that becomes obvious as you think about it a little more. Here's Matt.
If you are a school with larger enrollment or a public school where you could depend on some level of like appropriations from the state, you are going to have more kids on campus. You're going to have maybe 1,000 men on campus or several hundred men on campus. And so because of that, you could afford to carry a larger roster. You could afford to have more people on your team, more coaches, more everything else. And so you could be more selective about who is going to be eligible to play. You could still try to cling to not just for amateur ideals, but also I think pragmatically about how we can sort out who's a tramp athlete and who isn't, who is more likely to be able to hack it in school, who's going to have some time to learn our system and eat our boiled mutton or whatever ridiculous nutrition scheme was being put up there. And if you were Alabama and you could afford to have 55, 60 people on your roster and you're picking from hundreds of people, you can do that. And you can push for those things and it's okay. If you are Washington and Lee, or if you're Sewanee, or if you're even like, VPI, to Virginia Tech at this time, much smaller institution, one of these kind of schools, you don't want that. And it isn't because you don't necessarily believe the same things about amateurism that some of your fellow university presidents do. It's you can't afford to be picky if your player pool is 200 people.
On top of that, and in the vein of wanting to be more like the Big Ten, not letting freshmen play was seen as kind of a guard against athletes not caring about school. There is one thing a Washington Herald columnist wrote in December 1920 that a professional does not care to do. He is no student. This was an important talking point for the big Southern schools, and they reasoned that if entrance requirements were maintained, the professional athletes, the so-called tramp athletes of the day, who weren't really here to go to class and be part of the campus environment, would dodge the reputable college as they would the plague. So that's one thing. Second big thing, and here's a funny one, and it shows, Godfrey, how all politics is local and very specific to the moment. The new conference that these presidents in the South wanted to form would be strongly opposed to players getting paid to play in summer baseball leagues. Godfrey, about like the Cape Cod Baseball League? I know that's really your scene.
I do. I'm aware of that. It's hilarious to me that we're going to start this entire mission off with one concern, Alex, and that's that we don't want anyone to make any money but us. That's what I'm gleaning so far. First concern is not, let's get the schedule straight. Who are going to be members first is, hey, I don't want you making a couple $100 a wooden nickel in the Cape Cod Summer League. We wouldn't want that. By the way, a tramp athlete could work on a t-shirt.
In essence, this is what it comes down to. There's these two rules, the freshman ineligibility, the schools kind of seeking maybe a bit of a competitive advantage for the bigger schools, and also to uphold amateurism, the love of the game, etc. Say no freshmen can't play, have to be on campus for a year before you can play. And they also really do not want baseball players who play on their campuses to be able to make a buck in summer leagues. And not Cape Cod specifically. There were plenty of options, plenty of places where you could play. But the idea was that the big schools really did not want summer earnings for college baseball players when they were out playing, semi-professional baseball. It is hard to trace the specific reason why the bigger Southern schools were so opposed to this. As best I can ascertain it, it is that if athletes were entirely dependent on the largesse of their schools rather than being able to earn outside money, then the bigger, more resource schools would be in a better position to recruit and to retain those athletes. That is what fits most neatly with the desire not to let freshmen play, which is that if you have a bigger talent pool, then you can benefit as teams are able to pick from fewer and fewer players to come and play on their teams. And I think in the case of Southern baseball, the big Southern schools just saw an opportunity to again, uphold amateurism, and B, make sure that nobody else was making a buck in association with this big enterprise of college sports. Just the schools could make that buck. So, Stephen, in 1921, a bunch of these schools went off and decided to do their own thing. Remember, they'd been in this giant Southern Intercollegiate. They left and they formed a new conference, and they called it the Southern Conference.
If you didn't know, you would be shocked in hindsight at how powerful this conference is. Alabama, Auburn, Clemson, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Mississippi State, North Carolina State, Tennessee, Virginia Polytechnic, known also as Virginia Tech or VTI, Washington and Lee.
VPI, Stephen, wow.
VPI, that's right. Washington and Lee, Florida, LSU, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Tulane, Vandy, Vanderbilt, Maryland, and Sewanee, all within 2 years. As far as offshoots go, that's a pretty solid lineup.
Yeah, and between 1921 and 23, all of these schools jump into the Southern Conference. Some of them, kind of right away. Some of them after bouncing around for a year or two, doing their own thing or holding in the old Southern Intercollegiate. And when this split happened, I think this is a funny relic of the time. Everyone was just incredibly amicable and gentlemanly about the split of the SIAA into two leagues with the SoCon. I hope you take that away from this. So in December of 1920, as rumor had begun to swirl about this breakaway from the Southern Intercollegiate, a UNC professor named A.H. Patterson, who was the school's delegate to these meetings about the formation of the SoCon, had the following to say, quote, "Practically every large institution in the South is desirous of forming a new association which will not be antagonistic to the SIAA and will not attempt to disrupt or break up that organization, which it is freely recognized has had a salutary effect on Southern athletics. The SIAA and the SoCon agreed that they parted in friendship." Stephen, it's a fun contrast from, the current way of doing things where when a bunch of schools leave a conference, you are getting cease and desist letters and lawyers having a field day, sending strongly worded correspondences to each other and inevitable settlement negotiations and people talking about how their relationships with their mentors are never the same anymore. It's more complicated. Days gone by.
Who went with Fox and who went with ESPN?
Hold that thought about TV and broadcasting being involved in realignment. Hold that thought.
Was it a joke or was it foreboding?
Things don't always fit into neat narratives. One of the things that you will note if you read a lot of histories of the Southern Conference and if you track sort of the arc of realignment as a whole since this time is that a lot of people call the SoCon the first super conference. And it really wasn't. The first super conference, the first was the league that the SoCon broke out of, the Southern Intercollegiate. But the SoCon was certainly super conference adjacent. And by 1928, there were 23 teams in this league. And Stephen, it's funny because you have said on this podcast, I don't know how many times before, that super conferences are where things are heading for college athletics now, that they're the way of the future. But I swear to God, it's been tried before.
Yeah, it has been tried before. And I guess, are we setting up the fact that it might be tried again? Because the interesting thing at this point is, Alex, we rattled off a really impressive list of schools, right? With the exception of, spoiler alert, Sewanee not playing football anymore. This is a very solid
Division 3
lineup, right? Wash and Lee, obviously things changed for them. But on the whole, we're talking about modern day 9 and 10 game winning programs at the worst, and then some national champions in here. Probably the two best programs in college football are in here today. Alex, I want to point out that not so much the teams that left, but the teams that they left behind. Because I think the reason why, again, spoiler alert, we'll let you take it from here. It's not just about geography when you talk about conferences. So the aspiration to form what might have been called a super conference in the 1920s, it might foreshadow something that could happen in the 2030s or 2040s, is that geography is one way of identifying your program, but aspiration is another. Okay. And I'll say this, when there's a lot of money on the table, or the idea of a lot of money on the table, Alex, logic has a way of losing to ambition every time.
The new SoCon was a perfectly solid football league. It didn't award conference championships, but it had a handful of teams who won a lot of games and set themselves apart. Alabama was dominant in the mid-1920s. NC State, Georgia Tech, Georgia, Tulane, Tennessee, LSU, they all had their moments. Even Sewanee, which we talked about earlier, had a few good seasons in this league, though things were getting very rough there by the early 30s. But it was a super league. It was never going to be short of good teams, but it also wasn't as good a league as you might think. I think at least as best we can tell. So Alabama a couple times and Georgia Tech once were good enough to be retroactive computer national champions. Remember that the Associated Press didn't start crowning teams until 1936, but the consensus of the day was that the Big Ten was a better conference, and pretty frequently so too were the Southwest Conference, the Texas schools, and the Pacific Coast Conference, which is the actual Western League, even though the Big Ten was often called the Western League in this time as well. Those leagues had somewhere between 7 and 10 teams each. So the bottom of that conference, of those conferences, tended to be a lot more respectable than the bottom of the SoCon. In the Pacific Coast, it was UCLA and Montana who might bring up the rear some year, whereas in the SoCon, it was Mississippi State, which, as we covered in the Ole Miss Dead Letters episode earlier this season, was terrible in these years, and a school like Sewanee that really came to struggle as the SoCon got a little bit older. On pure football investment terms, sure, Alabama was no longer in a league with Wofford or Chattanooga, who had been around in the SIAA, but it still shared a league with VMI, with Washington and Lee. We haven't gone all the way at this point to reducing just the massive disparities between the big Southern schools and some smaller ones that are still sharing a conference with them at this point. Sports Reference's simple rating system, which is about as good a metric as we have to try to put an unruly sport in these times in context, puts the SoCon as a pretty distant fourth best conference behind the Big Ten, the Southwest, and the Pacific Coast. And it seems kind of obvious now that there'd be fit issues between all of these schools. And those fit issues, again, between an Alabama and a VMI would become more obvious as time went by. But it really wasn't all that clear at the time. Here's Matt.
The idea of a mid-major or a power school, with a few exceptions, wasn't exactly a thing in 1920. Some of the schools that we think of now as behemoths, Florida, I think, is a good example. 1924 Florida and 2014 Florida are not the same athletic department. And it's not just, for obvious reasons, because Florida was very different. But like, that was not a financial behemoth in this sport. We didn't have state universities with 40,000 students in 1922. Most people didn't go to college, period. So the difference between a larger state institution, which might have only been getting real money from the state for a couple of decades, and a smaller private school, it's a couple hundred kids.
The gap between little private schools, little mid-sized state schools, and big state schools, between schools in the cities and schools in the country, was just less of a chasm then than now. But a gap that was harder to obscure even then was the geographic one. The SoCon was smaller than the SIAA, but it was still big, and teams were still traveling by ground. This was a conference that stretched from Baton Rouge in Louisiana to College Park, a couple steps from the nation's capital. Now, did LSU go to play Maryland in the suburbs of DC? No, it didn't. Those schools actually never played each other in this era, and Tulane never went to Blacksburg to play Virginia Tech either. But this is just the point. There were very few ties to bind a lot of these schools to one another. They competed nominally in the same league, but they didn't compete ever at all. There were too many teams with too many miles between them. And it's funny, Stephen, because now you'll see SEC fans, I think rightfully, ruining it that Georgia might not make a trip to Tuscaloosa for like 6 or 7 years, or an SEC West school might not see an East school on their home field for a really, really long period of time. And fans hate that. But I mean, this was just the way of the world in the SoCon. You would share your conference with plenty of schools that you would just never see, but they're technically your conference opponents.
Hey, look, train schedules are tough, man.
In those ways, the SoCon was just like the gigantic Southern Intercollegiate before it. The SoCon started the work of whittling down the group of teams geographically and pitting like against like, but it clearly didn't finish that work. And in time, the SoCon had its own big policy fights that looked strikingly similar to the ones that brought down the SIAA. Remember that the old league had fought over freshman eligibility and summer baseball. The new league fought over different things, but they cut along some similar lines. So many of the SoCon schools wanted the right to broadcast games on TV, on radio, and others did not. They felt that broadcasting games was a significant threat to live attendance and was apt to make an amateur sport feel a lot more professional. Some of the schools that wanted to broadcast games were also wary of something else: centralized control. From the early 1930s, there was this significant debate around the SoCon about what might be done to control what we've talked about throughout the show, this out-of-control professionalism and commercialization of college sports that sort of had the whole country in a panic about what college sports were going to be. And some schools thought that the league needed a commissioner to oversee everything. Some actually thought that the conference needed a board of maybe 2 or 3 commissioners. Previously, and up to this point, the Southern Conference didn't have a single executive in charge of the entire thing. There was not one person who was in charge of Southern college football. And some of the SoCon, it would soon become clear, really, really, really did not want a person like that, because a lot of people in college sports, then as now, like to complain about their opponents cheating, about things being the wild, wild west out there and people violating the rules and nobody playing fair. But did they want to appoint a cop to deal with those cheaters that might also be able to deal with, I don't know, them? No, they certainly did not. This opposition to having any centralized oversight of the SoCon might seem funny now, because I compare it to, for instance, Greg Sankey, the commissioner of the SEC today, who has a bit of a cult of personality around him, which is kind of astonishing whenever I see it. But I think it's real that he has a significant network of media allies who will talk about his bold, visionary leadership of college sports, about how he could be the czar of college sports and we'd all be in such a better place, and how he is this central figure to making the SEC what it is now. And to some extent, this was the way that Mike Slive, his predecessor, was talked about. The SEC commissioner is a powerful, prestigious person. Everyone in college sports seems to agree. But this just was not how administrators saw centralized power in college sports in the 30s. And boy, were there some schools that were worried about that changing.
What it meant to be a college athletics administrator in the 1930s and 40s is extremely different than it is now. Prior to TV, the very idea of a powerful central executive at any level in college sports really didn't exist. Right? In 1940, the NCAA essentially doesn't have investigative power. It is just barely starting an NCAA basketball tournament, and it is not anywhere close to the most powerful tournament of this era. I think they had just finished the first one by 1940 and it nearly went bankrupt. You know, they played it in Evanston and almost nobody showed up. So there wasn't a lot of money. The central NCAA office, I don't think it had more than 5 full-time employees. And that's probably being very conservative. When you look at the conference offices, I don't think in 1940 anybody other than the Big Ten had a physical office. And the physical office might have been like a one person in the secretary. The people that really had the most power were athletic directors at this point. And that was universal. There was a skepticism of that kind of central authority. Conferences anywhere did not set standardized schedules. Like that was still done between ADs and schools for just about all sports. We didn't really have national tournaments for most things. So you take all of that and then you go into the deep South in the late 1930s, early 1940s, a skepticism of central authority and a deep-seated belief in home rule, not just politically or culturally, but everything else. Of course, that would be applied to college athletics.
Alex, the past mirrors the future, which mirrors the past here, and that you have a collection of highly aspirational Southern schools with a general paranoia of centralized authority and oversight. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
The thing I'm struck by at this point is that there's a collection of schools that see money on the table, or see the idea of money on the table coming down the pike. Then there's a collection of schools, and I feel like, maybe you're about to tell me this, the SoCon itself is going to lean more towards the second category of not necessarily status quo, but a resistance to some of the storms that are looming on the horizon for collegiate athletics. And that is a generalized professionalization and pretty significant structural changes. And they can feel and see that coming. And so the SoCon is going to have to make a decision that will either keep it relevant or essentially relegate it to history.
And it all built and built and built and built. And the fear of being controlled by this central authority and the geographic differences between schools and the financial differences that were only becoming more acute as the big schools started to get bigger and the small schools didn't. These things came together. And the Southern Conference, as time went by, started to break apart, as was probably inevitable. In 1933, 13 schools left the Southern Conference to form something called the Southeastern Conference that turned out to have a decent bit of staying power. The new SEC did not hire a commissioner, by the way, until 1940, 7 years in, after continued difficulty with cheating, with amateurism, finally led the schools that didn't want authority to accept authority. Those schools' exits took the SoCon from 23 schools down to 10, and after a few years, the league made a few additions to get back up to 16. But of course, the SEC cleaving off was not the last rupture in this league. The difference between Alabama and Washington and Lee had been big, but in time, the difference between Clemson and the Citadel was also huge, even though they're right there in the same state of South Carolina. In 1953, 7 more SoCon schools split off to form the Atlantic Coast Conference. Maryland, Duke, South Carolina, North Carolina, Wake Forest, Clemson, and NC State. Clemson's football patriarch, Frank Howard, coach of the program at the time, and who had been on staff at Clemson since 1931, said something when the SoCon split again and the ACC was formed. Quote him, "In the old Southern Conference, it was so big, I felt like a member of the Rotary Club and the Ku Klux Klan. Now maybe we're getting down to business."
Yikes. Slightly different there.
You want to translate that, Stephen, for a northerner like me?
I got to say, I had to go to Rotary clubs before as a reporter. I haven't attended any Klan meetings. Slightly dissimilar, but that is the way. Wow. That's the entire breadth of the white Southern experience, I guess. So Frank, not afraid to burn the bridge down as he leaves, but I do think the thing that you should take from this as we walk into the future, Alex, is that the SoCon is either okay with sitting in a moment in history and letting the future sort of pass without them, or they don't have the ability to fight that perception as we move forward.
Well, I think the SoCon doesn't want to die easily. And while it's extremely sad in a way that this league that was so important to the creation of modern college sports lost the entire SEC and really the entire ACC, the story gets, I don't know, maybe a little bit weirdly uplifting after that, or at least becomes sort of a lesson in trying to hang on to something. The SoCon, as it had been, died when the ACC schools left. And when Virginia Tech, which wouldn't be an ACC school until many decades later, exited in the 60s, that was the very last of the SoCon's founding members to roll out of town, to roll out of the conference. The SoCon, as its founders had dreamed it up, was dead. Gone. Nothing like what it was envisioned as.
Yeah.
But an entire conference's worth of schools, even since then, has come into the league and then left the league again. Like, there have been multiple generations of SoCon schools that have come and gone. Whole conferences worth of them. Richmond, William and Mary, Davidson, George Washington, West Virginia, East Carolina, App State and Georgia Southern, Marshall, Charleston, Elon. All of them entered and exited at various points between the 30s and the 2010s and just used the SoCon as a way station in the same way that before that, the SEC and the ACC schools did. And starting in 1982, the SoCon's remaining schools realized that Division 1A competition was probably not for them anymore. The 1AA playoffs had just started up a few years earlier, and they went off to reclassify and compete in those as a 1AA, now FCS conference. The league has found, though, different anchors that have come aboard and stayed aboard, which, as we've learned, is not always a guarantee with the Southern Conference. Furman and the Citadel, a pair of South Carolina schools, came in 1936, a few years after those SEC defections, and they've never left. Chattanooga, Western Carolina, they've been there since the 70s. And in fact, the league has actually not lost a member since 2014, when App State and Georgia Southern and Davidson and Elon left. App and Southern won 5 FCS or 1AA national titles while they were in this league, and their exits felt like yet another body blow, again, after losing the entire SEC and ACC. But when losing all of Southern college football doesn't cause a conference to go defunct, then losing App and Southern doesn't either. The SoCon still lives. Stephen, I feel like there's something there that I find a little bit commendable, maybe even more than a little bit commendable, that when I watch a certain subset of FCS teams play a game on Saturdays today, instead of being in the American Patriot Pride USA Conference or whatever they would have renamed it, there's still a little dollop of college sports history here. And that even if I don't know, Wofford wasn't what the SoCon had in mind at the very beginning, that it still plays under that banner.
That's a good way to look at it. I think it's two things. The first is that it is in name only. SoCon is just, it exists as a name that has a historical marker next to it, but does not exist, function, and certainly not populated by any one or any school or any even motivation or ideology that it was founded for. So let's get that out of the way. It's neat that the name still exists. And I think it inadvertently, Alex, I would not credit the SoCon as it evolves alongside of and then sort of goes underneath the rise of the SEC. I don't think that they intended to become this incubator of programs, but I do think, again, it's funny that, their history is marked by these hesitant moments in which they stare the future of the sport in the eye and they kind of dig their heels in a little bit. And it might be as important that they move to 1AA / what we call FCS, because it allows for the incubation of all these teams. Now, to jump forward to today, Alex, history is still repeating itself. The SoCon, writ large, is a perpetual incubator waiting for change. It lives in a cycle of change. We've seen it now historically that waves of programs are going to come through that are roughly in a sort of, if you bisected the United States and like you put it in 4 quadrants, that's the Southeast I'm talking about. It could be anything from Texas all the way up to your alma mater, Maryland. It's a pretty big interpretation of the Southeastern United States. So programs will come through. Those with aspirations to move on that are football centric end up doing so. Right now, it's just kind of like it was, which is a too chunky mixture of teams that are arranged by geography, but with wildly different ideology. So you have schools like Wofford, and you have schools like Citadel, and their priorities are never going to match the places that the SoCon populates now. So these young, ag schools or commuter schools, we call them, degree farms, or frankly, they're just not as prestigious. They're not as private, and they have larger enrollment. They're cheaper to go to, and they're going to attract football, and they're going to attract a type of football that wants to move up to Division I or FBS. Okay. So the idea of what does Western Carolina have in common with Wofford? Not a ton. And that's just the same as if we go back and look at what did Wash and Lee have in common, Alex, with LSU. And so as much as the names have changed, the situation remains the same. I do think, Alex, that there's a cautionary tale here, and I'm going to kind of set you up to take us home. Conferences are not bound by geography. Geography makes a lot of sense. Geography makes a ton of sense sometimes. And we all have points of nostalgia in our experience with this sport where we remember X schools and Y divisions or conferences, and that map in our brains colors our logic. But what this story of the Southern Conference really tells us is geography will only hold you so far. When you have a like-minded goal, you will partner with a school, or you will move away from schools that you should be partnered with, again, in terms of geography or history or tradition, every single time. Aspiration is going to drive this sport to change itself over and over and iterate in a way that you just don't see in any other sport at all.
A fun truth about modern realignment is that those same aspirations that bring leagues together are now so often the very same things that break them apart. Nowadays, that series of transactions tends to revolve around, the pure dollars and cents, the media exposure, the television contracts. But the Big 12 came together because some schools in the Southwest Conference and the schools in the Big 8 realized they could find more TV revenue if they worked together. And then the Big 12 fractured and had to save itself from its deathbed because the two leading schools in this new TV money creation realized that they could be part of a bigger and better TV money creation somewhere else. And in turn, a bunch of schools from the American Athletic moved to the Big 12 looking for the same exact thing. A bunch of schools from Conference USA moved to the American seeking the exact same thing. Everyone is always climbing. Everyone is always searching for safe ground to sit on in college sports. But once you get there, what do you get? Get more money, definitely. Get more happiness? I think it's questionable. We recorded this show in the summer of 2023 after the SEC, now with a supposedly very powerful central commissioner, had conference meetings as it was preparing to go to 16 teams in 2024 and completely failed in those meetings to agree on a new scheduling model to reflect its massive new size as a 16-team FBS league. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And I don't think we should disregard how similar it is to the same exact disagreements on different subjects that broke apart the Southern Intercollegiate, that broke apart the Southern Conference. Here's Matt Brown.
As you grow, even if you're all exactly on the same page for everything, you get above 14 really. And I've heard commissioners and sport administrators at leagues tell me this. Logistically, things get more complicated. Creating standardized schedules becomes a very political, emotional, challenging mess. Figuring out where things are going to be hosted, how you keep everybody happy, again, separate from television, gets harder.
Obviously, the new SEC isn't breaking up, certainly not anytime soon. But Stephen, I think the funny thing about the SoCon story is how it is entirely different, but entirely the same from the little squabbles that we are going to see more and more of in the 16-team SEC, the 16-team Big Ten, and certainly if these leagues get larger. You know, college football games didn't become a regular TV institution until after World War II. The big issue of the moment for the SoCon wasn't about TV money. But this conference came into being for two reasons: for convenience and to separate the big and the small. It's why the SoCon was born. And those are the same exact things that killed it. The old Southern Intercollegiate, it was unwieldy. It mixed big and small. It mixed invested and not. You know, Bama and North Carolina are there with Cumberland and Mercer. And there were teams from Louisiana and from the Carolinas with so many miles between them that never went to see each other. And then the new SoCon ran into the same problems that caused the Southern Intercollegiate to break up. Auburn did not need to be in a league with Wash and Lee. LSU did not need to be in a league with UVA. They needed different things. They wanted different things in life. And now they'll fight with different people about different things. There'll be smaller things sometimes. There'll be, what should our scheduling model be? What should our conference position be on the involvement of the bowls in the playoff or whatnot? But they will always have things to fight about. And the more people you put under the same roof, the more things you're going to find to fight about. And I think that that's the best lesson of the Southern Intercollegiate, of the SoCon, and of the next era of so-called super conferences. It's hard to get along, get more than 12, 14 people in a room.
I think you could consider this story an argument against strict geographic qualifiers or any kind of strict qualifier for a conference. Just because you're a few miles from somebody doesn't mean your priorities are going to be remotely aligned. And also, just because you're making sense at the time, 10, 20, 30, 40 years of building tradition, it doesn't mean you always will have the same goals.
But that's the arc of college sports. Everyone is always looking for a better lunch table. Everyone's a social climber. And if you see yourself as a jock, you are probably never going to get as far away as you would like from the dorks. The interviewee you heard throughout much of this episode is Matt Brown. He's a close friend of ours. He's also the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter at extrapointsmb.com, and also the author of What If, a book about college sports what ifs. He's a tremendous historian of the sport, and we are grateful for his time. We read a lot to make these shows. Some especially helpful sources this time around, in addition to Matt, include Associated Press dispatches and stories from the Charlotte News, the News and Observer, and the Winston-Salem Journal, all in North Carolina, the State in South Carolina, the Anniston Star and the Montgomery Advertiser in Alabama, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I'm Alex Kirshner. I wrote the show and got help from my co-hosts at Split Zone Duo, Stephen Godfrey and Richard Johnson. And our audio engineer here to make it all sound magical is the great Anthony Vito. Thank you to all of them and to you for helping to make Season 2, Episode 6 of Dead Letters, and this entire second season of the show, the SoCon.